Welcome to the Augusta Golf Show podcast. Now, here's John Patrick.
Dr. Bob Jones IV is a clinical psychologist with a practice in the Atlanta area. Bob is also the grandson of Bob Jones. It's a pleasure to welcome Dr. Bob Jones IV back to the Augusta Golf Show. How are you, Bob?
I'm doing great, John. Thanks so much for having me back.
Thank you for doing this. I want to preface this conversation by saying I might be asking a slew of naive questions. I'm trying to play the role of the listener. Some things the listener might ask about what's taken place in the game of golf over the last few weeks. Grayson Murray, Lexi's comments from last week, mental health in general. Let me start with this. Being a professional, what does a professional look for when it comes to depression? Are there signs? Are they different for various people?
There are signs. To actually diagnose depression, there's a series of symptoms that we look for, most of which would be like frequent teariness, loss of interest in things that used to provide a lot of interest to somebody. The secondary symptoms, you'd look at changes in sleep patterns, changes in social interactions. So there's a whole host of those. And then when you start seeing those, then you have to start looking at how long has that been going on. But I think when we're talking about situations like the ones that you mentioned and others, I think there's something that's a little bit more going on than just depression. I mean, I think that there's a real problem that athletes face, especially, and that is this: the higher you go in a sport, the more isolated you are going to become. And the more isolated that you become, if you are prone to that kind of thing, like to depression, like to difficulties in thinking clearly, all sorts of stuff like that. The higher you go, the more lonely you get, the more isolated you get. You don't have the opportunity to have the kind of interactions that people have that help them stay healthy. And it's a terribly lonely. Playing golf at an elite level, or any sport at an elite level, is a terribly lonely thing. And, this is nothing really new. I mean, of course, it's sad what happened with Grayson. Mm-hmm. And I really admire Lexi for coming out and speaking about what she's had to contend with. But, we've had a couple of these over the last few years. But I remember even going back to a conversation with Carol Mann, and she was very open about how incredibly difficult it was for her, that she would go back to her hotel room after playing competitively, playing a competitive round, and she said she'd just sit in a fetal position in the corner and cry at night. And this is back in the 1960s. And I think it even goes back to my grandfather had some issues when he played, where he would lose like 15 pounds during the course of a tournament. And, and sometimes he would have to sit in a scalding hot bathtub with 3 fingers of bourbon after he finished a competitive round, just to deal with what he felt was the pent-up stress. But the trick is, you feel that, but you don't necessarily let the people know who are close to you or who are watching you play or any of that. They have no idea what's going on, which then further isolates you some more. So, I mean, it's a really tough place to be.
Here comes another naive question.
Sure.
Would those who are driven, would they be more susceptible than those who don't necessarily have that sort of quality?
Mm-hmm, I think so. It's you see the same thing in CEOs. The more driven you are to excellence, basically what you're doing is the more driven you are to excellence, the smaller your social environment is going to be because, and captains of ships sort of go through the same thing. I mean, eventually you start out in this big pool, and at each level you go up, the pool just gets smaller and smaller and smaller. Think of it this way. You go to hurricane tournaments in golf, and you've got several hundred kids, maybe 1,000 kids playing across the country in these different events. Then you move up another stage and half of those get winnowed out. And then you move up into college and half of those get winnowed out. And then, you start hitting the mini tours and the Corn Ferry tours. And as you go up that pyramid, it gets to be a smaller and smaller group. And the pressure to perform is just relentless. This is why so many times you will watch some of these athletes, at least at the very top levels, and they will have psychologists and trainers and agents and this and that and caddies, and they're surrounded by an entourage which at least provides them with some human connection.
We're talking with Dr. Bob Jones IV here on the Augusta Golf Show. That team, those people, what can someone who is close to a depressed individual do to help?
Oh, I think you just sort of listen. You have to listen. And by listen, I don't mean just let them talk about what's on their mind, but you have to actually listen to what they're really saying. And you also have to remember that when you're dealing with somebody that's depressed or you're dealing with somebody that's going through a real mental health struggle, there's always a tendency to want to almost normalize what they're saying, or to say, well, that's just a one-off, or, well, they didn't really mean that. One of the things that we're trained to do in dealing with potential suicidal behavior is you always take any reference in that regard very, very seriously. But the problem is that sometimes the people, when they're feeling that isolated, their references are very, very obscure. And then when they do make a reference, it's so uncomfortable that people will tend to say, well, they didn't really mean that, and not take it as seriously as it should be.
You mentioned suicide, talking about Grayson Murray. I'm going to ask you to speculate, and that's probably not fair. And if you don't want to answer this, I understand. How do you think someone that is depressed and or possibly suicidal processes the Grayson Murray story? When they hear it, what do they think?
That is extremely speculative, but knowing the dynamic, it would depend where they are in that process, because one of the things that happens is as people get farther along in that process, by the time they make the decision to actually do something about it, to actually take action, they have become so isolated and alone and cut off from their own emotion that oftentimes seems to be the only way out for them. I'll give you an example of what I mean. It's kind of like one of the things that we know, for example, is that people who actually will attempt suicide, they will get really, really depressed until they make the decision, and then they can seem like everything's better because they've made the decision. It's no longer a question in their mind. So how a person would react to news of something like Grayson Murray would really depend in a large extent on where they are in that process. Is it possible that it could give some of them a sense that, well, he did it, so therefore it might be okay if I did? Yeah, it's possible, but each particular case is unique.
Sure. If you have been diagnosed as being depressed or possibly even suicidal, like alcoholism, is it possible that one day all of those feelings no longer exist, or maybe, you're always a recovering alcoholic? Or is it something that you kind of always have to be aware of? I think it's not so much you have to be aware of that as you have to be aware of the circumstances that can lead you down that rabbit hole. But I do find that there's an extremely good statistic that I always like to remind people of, and that is that of people who attempt suicide, by attempt, I mean they're not successful, right? They just attempted.
Something. I last time I said, I think the number is like 86% of them never attempted again. So so the important thing is to really hear where people are coming from, to take what they're saying very, very seriously, and because it is the kind of thing that people can bounce back from, very, very often bounce back from, and go on to live very normal, productive lives. Happens all the time.
I'm attempting with you to have a healthy conversation about suicide. Can you have a healthy conversation about suicide with someone who is suicidal?
Absolutely.
Okay.
There comes a point in that process, John, where they want to talk about it. There will come a point when the decision is made where they don't want to talk about it anymore. But up until almost the very last point, there will come a time when they desperately want people to be able to talk about how they're feeling and what's going on. Oh, very definitely. This whole process, in some ways, it's more like a disease process. Like if you ever look at somebody that gets diagnosed with any kind of disease, one of the things they can tell you of the disease is what's called a natural history, and that is they know that the disease will left untreated, it will progress from this stage to this stage to this stage to this stage. And very often the suicidal process is the same way. It has very, very distinct steps through which it progresses. And at any point, it can be intervened on, oftentimes and most of the time with great success.
He is Dr. Bob Jones, the fourth, a clinical psychologist. He works out of the Atlanta area. He has been a friend for almost 30 years. Bob, thank you for saying yes to this. I deeply appreciate it.
Glad to do it, John.
BackstageCountry.com, your online home for all things country music. There are lots of country music couples we love to watch. They sing about their love and bring it to life in the music they share with fans. Text couples to 45911 to learn more about 5 couples we think were and are country music magic. Text couples to 45911 to get a link to the list sent right to your phone from BackstageCountry.com.